This video is brought to you by Nebula. On Tuesday, after talks with the US in Saudi Arabia, Ukraine said it was prepared to accept a 30-day ceasefire with Russia. The US also said it would resume all military aid to Kyiv, including intelligence sharing, after having suspended it a couple of weeks ago following a dramatic clash between US President Donald Trump and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky at the White House. Going into the talks, Zelensky, who had previously resisted a ceasefire largely because he thought it would just give Russia time to rearm, suggested he would be open to a partial ceasefire in the air, at sea, and on energy infrastructure. In the end, however, it looks like the US has convinced Ukraine to accept a more comprehensive ceasefire, which includes a pause in fighting along the front lines, in exchange for the resumption of all US military aid and intelligence sharing. So in this video, we'll take a look at what was agreed on Tuesday, and whether Russia could actually agree to a ceasefire. Last week, we interviewed UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer to ask him your questions about the UK's new plans to support Ukraine and European defence initiatives in the aftermath of Trump's recent actions. Watch the video now by clicking the link in the description. First though, let's start with a bit of context and compare the European and American proposals going into Tuesday's negotiations. The US's Ukraine peace plan involved a land ceasefire along the current front lines. This means freezing the front lines where they are, allowing Russia to keep what it's already taken of eastern Ukraine, about a fifth of its territory. Ukraine and its more hawkish European allies have resisted this idea because they think it undermines Ukraine's territorial integrity. And past experience suggests that Russia might just use any pause in fighting to rearm. For context, after the London summit at the start of this month, Zelensky and UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer both cited the failure of the Minsk Agreements of 2014-15, which were intended to stop the conflict in eastern Ukraine's Donbas region. A few weeks after Russia's invasion of Crimea in spring 2014, Russian-backed separatists, helped by Russian troops, began fighting Ukrainian forces in Luhansk and Donetsk, collectively known as the Donbas. In an attempt to end the fighting, a deal was brokered by France and Germany and signed by Russia and Ukraine to ensure an immediate bilateral ceasefire, including the withdrawal of forces and heavy weaponry from the line of contact. However, the Minsk Agreement failed, with Russian forces repeatedly breaching the ceasefire terms, and in February 2022, after launching a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Putin declared that the agreements no longer existed. This is actually what triggered the now infamous Oval Office spat between Zelensky and JD Vance last month, as Zelensky pushed back against Vance's calls for diplomacy by noting that Russia had violated previous diplomatic agreements, which is when everything kicked off. This explains why Zelensky and Europe were originally opposed to the US proposal of a land ceasefire, which Zelensky described as a trap. Instead, Ukraine and its EU allies have proposed an alternative partial ceasefire, an idea that French President Emmanuel Macron first floated to the newspaper Le Figaro a couple of weeks ago, which would involve a truce in the sky, at sea, and on energy infrastructure, but crucially not on the ground. Last week, Zelensky posted a statement on X, saying that Ukraine was prepared to release prisoners and enact a truce in the sky, on energy infrastructure, and an immediate ceasefire at sea, quote, if Russia will do the same. In his post, Zelensky mentioned a ban on missiles, long-range drones, bombs on energy and other civilian infrastructure. France's Foreign Minister Jean-Noël Barrot explained that the logic behind proposing a ceasefire in the air is to, quote, determine whether Vladimir Putin is acting in good faith, and argued that it would enable Europe to gauge Putin's attitude to serious peace negotiations. However, on Tuesday, Ukraine agreed to the American proposal of a more comprehensive ceasefire, presumably because it was the only way to get the Americans to resume military support and intelligence sharing, which, as the recent Russian advance in Kursk has demonstrated, remains vital to Ukraine's military capabilities. So what happens next? Well, the ball is in Russia's court right now. So far, Russia hasn't had to compromise on its war aims at all. The Trump administration has given numerous concessions to Russia in terms of enforcing Ukraine's neutrality, i.e. preventing it from joining NATO, at least for the foreseeable future, and ruling out putting American peacekeeping troops on the ground in Ukraine, which are both things that Russia has demanded. Agreeing to a ceasefire at this point in the war, however, would require Putin to concede his more maximalist war objectives, which include totally annexing the 4 Ukrainian oblasts that Russia claimed in late 2022, namely Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia and Kherson, While Russia currently controls most of Luhansk, Russian forces only control between half and two-thirds of the other 3 oblasts, and a land ceasefire along the current front lines would fall far short of this, especially if it preceded a more permanent peace. While Trump has said that he believes Putin wants peace, according to Bloomberg's political editor Alex Wickham, Putin is unwilling to compromise on his maximalist war objectives, and is ready to continue fighting the war if he does not get what he wants. However, if Putin does refuse America's ceasefire proposal, this could, in a sense, be good for Ukraine, both because US military aid has now resumed, and because it would prove to Trump that the real obstacle to peace is Putin and not Zelensky. Here, the big question is how America would respond. In a sense, getting Ukraine to agree to the ceasefire was the easy bit, because America has enormous leverage over Ukraine given the Ukrainian army's dependence on American tech and aid. Getting Russia to the table is the harder bit. After all, the US doesn't have any obvious leverage over Russia, given sanctions can't be escalated much further, and Trump clearly doesn't want to escalate military support to Ukraine. However, if the US can somehow convince Putin to agree to the deal, the big question would be how to make sure Russia doesn't just use any pause in fighting to resupply and rearm its military in order to take another shot at Ukraine once Trump's attention is turned elsewhere. Much to Ukraine's disappointment, Trump's Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth has ruled out deploying American troops as peacekeepers, which is why the UK, France, and other Western powers are currently trying to muster a coalition of the willing to take the strain instead. However, Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov recently ruled out the idea of European peacekeepers in Ukraine, and stated that Russia would interpret such a move as the, quote, direct, official, undisguised involvement of NATO. The risk for Ukraine here is that America and Russia negotiate a deal that bans either American or European peacekeepers from Ukraine, leaving Ukraine vulnerable to another assault down the line once Russia has rebuilt its military. If this were to be offered, Ukraine might just decide to reject it, and hope that, in the absence of American support, Europe can step up. All in all, while Tuesday's events undeniably represented progress, it remains very much an open question whether the US can thread the needle and negotiate a ceasefire that's acceptable to both parties. Like a lot of things, this whole situation is very much in a state of flux. With Trump breaking international alliances and fundamentally changing geopolitics, the world has certainly felt more unstable. Every day, we're faced with weird headlines, from Trump's trade war with Canada and Mexico to Elon Musk's not quite so efficient Department of Government Efficiency, or Trump declaring war on Mars to try and regain some international allies. Okay, that last one might not be real, but we do dive deep into the chaotic world of US politics in our series WTF USA. This is our series where we explain everything that's happened in the land of the free. With Trump behind the Resolute desk, the number of WTF moments only looks likely to increase. Unlike some of our other serious videos, the tone of WTF USA is more lighthearted, and takes something of an irreverent look at what's going on. If you're interested, WTF USA can be found exclusively on Nebula. Nebula is also home to other incredible original content from your favourite creators, like Real Life Law's series War Room. Given how much conflict and geopolitics is going on right now, the show attempts to get you up to speed every month, explaining what's been going on and helping you to stay informed with the latest from geopolitics. So if you didn't know, Nebula is an independent, creator-owned streaming platform that specializes in thoughtful content, from creators like Wendover Productions, Neo, and Real Life Law. It's not just WTF USA either. You can also watch every normal TLDR video on Nebula ad-free, and in some cases before they even land on YouTube. If you're not a member already, click the link in the description to get 40% off. We really hope you check out the series, and as always, thank you for your support.